Welcome to the 21st. I'm Nyla Boodoo. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has announced some big changes, major ones, to the way packaged foods are labeled. Among those changes, for the first time, labels will list not only how much total sugar is in a serving, but how much of that sugar is added in the form of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, or other sweeteners. When we first heard about this change, we immediately wondered about corn growers across the state of Illinois. But we learned from a conversation with a representative of the Illinois Corn Growers Association that just 1% of the corn grown in Illinois is used to make high fructose corn syrup. The rest, the vast majority, is used as livestock feed or gets converted to ethanol. Across the country, the FDA labeling changes are being applauded by some and criticized by others. No surprise. How are food companies responding, and what do these changes mean for you, the consumer? Joining us on the line to help answer those questions from New York is Marion Nessel. She's a professor of nutrition, food studies, and public health at New York University, a food policy advocate, and author of the books Food Politics and What We Eat. She can take your questions about this, too. As always, give us a call at 1-800-222-9455. That's 1-800-222-9455. You can tweet to 21st Show. Marion, welcome to the 21st. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, glad to be here.
What does this change do, and when will we start to see this information on labels?
Well, my guess is that some companies will start implementing it right away. It's not required until May 2018 for big food companies, and little ones get until May 2019 to implement it. But they'll start right away. As soon as they're changing their labels, they'll start putting this on it.
Marion, I know we've been having increasing conversations about sugar and how much we consume. What motivated this change to the way for the FDA to change the way that sugar is labeled?
Well, Center for Science and the Public Interest filed a petition in 2013 in which it detailed the rationale for putting added sugar on labels. Americans consume roughly twice the amount of sugar that's recommended. High sugar intake is associated with a lot of diseases and problems, and it's a marker of food processing. The more added sugar there is, the more highly processed the foods are. And so the FDA thought about that and figured the time has come. There's a lot of interest in sugar intake and its effect on health right now.
Mm-hmm. And we had one of our listeners tweeting that on average, this is one of our news partners actually, we eat 130 pounds of sugar a year. Is that accurate?
It's something like that, but that includes everything. That's high fructose corn
syrup. And that's fructose. Is that including like fructose that we get in fruit and things like that?
Yeah, the fructose and glucose that we get in fruit. It's the amounts that are in. It's the amounts that are in the sugar that we add at the table, but it's also the amounts that are in processed food, high fructose corn syrup, all of the different kinds of sugars that are added to foods. The list of names for them is about 50 or 60 long. They're called by lots and lots of things.
Well, and as we think about this, I wonder if you can help explain to us what types of sugars will now fall into the category of, quote, added sugar.
Well, the ones that manufacturers put in when they're making the food product. There will be total sugars, and that will include the sugars that are intrinsically present in raisins or fruits or anything else. And then there will be a separate category for added sugars, which are the ones that are used in manufacturing. Now, those are exactly the same biochemically. There's no difference between them at all. So what the added sugars label does is to indicate that this is a highly processed food and that the sugars that are added are diluting the nutritional quality of that food.
I was going to ask you what difference you think it makes when you're consuming sugar in a food product that's added.
Well, it doesn't make any difference. Sugar is sugar. But what it tells you is that the nutritional quality of that product will be diluted because sugar has calories and no nutrients. So you're losing the nutritional value that comes along with the sugars that are in fruits.
I think the overhaul will also include changing serving sizes to be more realistic. What does that mean?
Well, the serving sizes have always been kind of a joke because they seem so tiny.
Well, you're always just sitting there, right? You have to do the calculation. Like I always look at the serving size and then I look at the package and I think, how realistic is this? And I try to figure
Yeah,
out what I'm eating and if that fits.
yeah, not very realistic. If you're a scientist and do the measurements, the amounts of cereal, for example, a lot of the cereals had measurements of 3/4 of a cup or something like that. And depending on how puffy the cereal was, people would eat more or less than that. But you had to do the math. You had to have a calculator, or you had to have a really good sense of mathematics to figure out that the calories and nutrients that were listed on the label were per serving size, and then you had to calculate the number of servings that you were actually eating. And it wasn't very helpful. People sort of tend to see the calorie number that's there and forget about the serving. So everybody thinks that a soft drink, for example, had 100 calories no matter how big it was because it said 100 calories per serving.
And do you think that, obviously this is an issue you've spent a lot of time studying. Do you think that we are, as American consumers, do you think that we're good at reading labels and making those distinctions? It sounds like you're saying we're not.
Oh, I don't think we're good at reading the labels at all. The labels are enormously complicated. And when they were first devised in 1993, there was a lot of consumer testing that went on of various different kinds of label formats. And the FDA picked the one that was least worst. I don't know how else.
Great.
Nobody understood any of them. And so the FDA made a choice about it, and now we've lived with that choice for a long time. And so the FDA has continued to maintain that design because it's too hard to try to educate the public about a whole different one. So the new label is tweakings of the old one. But demonstrably difficult to understand. People tend to look for calories, for the amount of sugars, for the amounts of fats, and for the vitamins, and not much else.
I'm speaking with Marion Nessel, nationally known food policy advocate. She's joining us on the phone from New York. And Marion, what should we be looking for in food labels then? If we kind of are tending to just look at calories, or we're trying to look at it quickly, what's the most educated way we can look at labels as they stand now, and then when we're thinking about these new ones with the added sugar?
Well, first of all, we're talking about food products here. And if you're going to promote a healthful diet, what you want people to be eating is foods, not food products. You want them to be eating real foods. Real foods don't have nutrition facts labels. The healthiest diets don't need nutrition facts labels. So if you're looking at a processed food, depending on what you care about, you want to look at sugar, salt, and calories. I mean, it seems to me those are the most important things. You want to choose foods that have the least amount of salt and the least amount of added sugars. And depending on what your calorie balance is, you want to think about where you get those calories from.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this change will help consumers be more conscious of how much sugar they're consuming? Do you think that just having these conversations about labeling maybe helps just kind of surface these conversations about sugar in general to the general public?
Well, I think they will, and the idea that added sugars will be on there is something that's really quite important. A lot of people will look at those and pay attention to it, and I think the added sugar label will do a couple of things. It will educate consumers, but it will also encourage food companies to put less sugar in their products, and that's part of the point.
Well, and if you think about examples, I wonder how you think food companies are doing on this. And I want to get to the industry side of this because we do have a couple statements from different industries that I wanted you to respond to. But I'm thinking in particular of Kraft and how Kraft made a change a couple months ago or 6 months ago to just adding turmeric and taking out the artificial colors and the macaroni and cheese. And they just did it really quietly. And then they did it, months ago and didn't change anything. And then came out and said, hey, by the way, we did this. I mean, do you think the food companies are getting better at processed foods and trying to be more natural about it?
Yeah, they certainly are under pressure from the public. And in fact, the amount of sugar in food products, in a lot of food products, is going down. Sugar intake in the United States in general is down. It's down quite a bit, largely because people aren't aren't drinking as much sugary beverages, and that accounts for a lot of sugar intake. So that's gone down, and I think people are trying to eat more healthfully, and this ought to help them do that.
Do you think that the term natural can just be a marketing term that doesn't have any real meaning? I think because sometimes if you're thinking about things that get kind of slapped on, what gets put outside the label, how regulated is that in terms of, because now I'm thinking maybe companies might start putting no added sugar and people think, oh, there's not extra sugar in this now.
Well, that would be good if they had no added sugar. Certainly the term natural has been the subject of a great deal of debate because it has no regulatory meaning at all. It's a marketing term. If you slap natural, organic, no trans fats, no gluten on food products, people think they're healthy and that they have fewer calories and buy them. But these are largely marketing terms. I mean, the gluten-free one is very helpful to people with celiac disease, but the rest of them are, really, people should be eating food. Food doesn't have nutritional facts labels on it because it doesn't need them.
Now, I wanted to ask you about critics from the industry, particularly the Sugar Association. They say the FDA has not demonstrated a scientific link between sugar and disease. Do you think that's a legitimate argument?
Well, one of their arguments is that the sugars that are added and the sugars that are intrinsic are the same, and that's a correct argument. But it misses the point that adding sugar dilutes the nutritional value of the product, and that there is so much evidence that links diets high in added sugars to poor health outcome in lots and lots of different ways: obesity, heart disease, chronic diseases of all kinds, type 2 diabetes. All of these things are associated with sugar intake, and it's very, very difficult to attribute a disease to one particular food in the diet. Sugars may be a marker of unhealthful diets, and the sugar industry has to face that. I mean, their real concern is not scientific. Their concern is that they may lose sales.
I wonder also, when you're thinking about food companies, how much now we may see, and I think we saw a lot of this even, 10 to 15 years ago, of swapping out sugar with sugar substitutes. And I wonder what your thoughts are about sugar substitutes, and if you think we're trading one bad thing for another, well, maybe not potentially bad thing, but we don't really know the scientific. I think there's not enough research about sugar substitutes long term, right?
Well, lots of people have been consuming them for a long time, and the FDA would argue that there's very little evidence for harm. There's a lot of talk about harm on the Internet, but the science really doesn't show it. What the science does show is that artificial sweeteners don't do any good. They're not associated with better health outcome. They're not associated with better weight outcome. People who use a lot of artificial sweeteners tend to compensate for the loss of sugar and sugar calories by eating other kinds of foods that aren't necessarily helpful. So it's very hard to sort all this stuff out. People who eat artificial sweeteners are not necessarily following other principles of good health. And the healthiest people are people who just eat reasonable diets based on food and use sugar in moderation. I'm greatly in favor of sugar, by the way. I like it a lot.
Well, that's good to know. I was going to ask you, as we're thinking about this, I think everyone gets that what a healthful diet should be, and keeping processed foods to a minimum. But when you're thinking, I think obviously the reason processed foods exist is for the convenience of it. And when people have big families or busy lives, that's how they end up eating processed food. So how do you suggest everyone think about the balance of how much processed foods you should have in your life versus not?
Well, it depends on which processed foods. Some processed foods are healthier than others. Obviously, the ideal would be that people cooked home-cooked meals every day. A lot of people can't do that, or can't even come close to doing that. You want to have a lot of fruits, vegetables, and grains in your diet, and then the rest of it doesn't matter nearly as much. So the food label helps a little bit on that, but everybody should have this in perspective, that there's a real difference between buying macaroni and cheese out of a package and buying it and cooking it yourself. The nutritional differences can be quite great. On the other hand, grab a package every now and then, grab a pre-prepared meal. That's the way people live these days. And if you're going to live like that, then you do the best you can with it.
Really quickly, we just have less than a minute left. How do you regulate your own sugar? Because you said you like sugar. Do you just kind of keep an eye on, okay, well, I'm not going to have this many baked goods of sugar?
Well, I'm one of these people who follows my own nutritional advice, and partly, and I would never advise anyone to do anything that I didn't do myself. I find it very easy to follow my own dietary advice, which is to make sure that I eat plenty of vegetables, fruits, and grains, that I don't eat too much junk food, and I balance calories. I think calories have really a lot to do with, let me put it another way, a food way rather than a nutrition way. It's portion size.
Portion size. Thanks for that. Marion Nessel joining us from New York. We appreciate it.
The 21st is made possible by the library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, fostering knowledge in its disciplines by recruiting and retaining library faculty, researchers, and thought leaders with deep subject matter knowledge and expert librarianship. The University Library at Illinois.